New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the concept of Hylozoism, the idea that everything is alive. With me is Professor Thomas Brophy, who is the president of the California Institute of Human Science. He is the author of numerous books, and probably with regard to today's subject, his first book will be of the most importance. It's called The Mechanism Demands a Mysticism, Explorations of Spirit, Matter, and Physics. His other books include The Origin Map, a prehistoric megalithic astrophysical map of the universe, as well as two other books co-authored with Robert Bauval called African Genesis, the Prehistoric Origins of Ancient Egypt, and Imhotep the African, Architect of the Cosmos. Welcome again, Thomas.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful to have this discussion with you, and I'm very grateful that you've come to Albuquerque to be with me.
It's my pleasure. It's always great fun.
So, Hylozoism is a term that probably most people aren't familiar with. People have heard about Panpsychism and metaphysical idealism, dual aspect monism, but Hylozoism is a little bit of a different twist on basically the ontological metaphysics of reality.
Yeah, Hylozoism is the term I settled on using in that book, The Mechanism Demands a Mysticism, for this fundamental point that when we get to the bottom of how consciousness can exist in the world, and when the quantum state wave function collapses to one particular aspect, there's something connected with the consciousness that happens there, because the conscious choice of the researcher, the experiment, is related to the outcome. And so there's a little opening for something not material aspect to be related to how material functioning. Mm-hmm. So then if you use that as the basis for having the consciousness, bringing into our understanding of the nature of reality, the consciousness aspect, as well as the material physical aspect, that connection seems most simply, sort of by Occam's razor, to happen everywhere, in all things. And the term hylo, matter, zo, life, hylozoism, I chose to be able to connect it to two other terms, hylostatism and hylostochastism. Those two I kind of coined. Mm-hmm. So hylostatism, matter is static in a fourth dimensional sense. So when we're talking about the foundations of quantum mechanics now, so when you talk about the collapse of the quantum wave function, physics doesn't tell us what happens in that collapse. It's a non-algorithmic process. Yeah. And so as far as physics can take us, either the outcome, according to the probability distribution, is which one comes out is purely random. Mm-hmm. So I use the term hylostochastism for that. Stochastic means random. Or it's somehow determined by a mathematical function. There's reasons why that can't be the case now through Bell's theorem and that sort of thing. But
hidden variables.
Yes. But there have always been people who argued that must be the case somehow. So we would call that hylostatism. It's static in four-dimensional sense. It's a deterministic outcome. Now, the third possibility is what I called Hylozoism. Okay, there's something that is neither random, neither purely random, nor neither deterministically fixed. And that could be involved in, be connected with the creative aspect of the universe or the consciousness aspect of the universe. So that's what I called Hylozoism, Hylozoic.
In effect, you're saying that we are alive because the universe is alive.
Yes. Everything... The Hylozoic term suggests that everything has a lifelike aspect. So it's very similar to the term panpsychism, in which everything has a mind-like aspect. It's just a slight variation, really, on that.
Well, the founders of quantum physics all had similar views when they looked at this problem, to my understanding.
Yes. Some of the founders of quantum physics, they wanted to just stick with the physics. To do that, they just would not address questions like consciousness and how it operates. And most of the founders of physics, well-known names in the field, who did look into the question, came to a kind of a panpsychist type approach.
I thought the introduction to your book, the Mechanism, Demands, and Mysticism, was very interesting. The way you put it, you said physics doesn't prove mysticism, but it demands it. And you quoted Prince Louis de Broglie, the Nobel laureate physicist who back in the 1920s actually said that the mechanism demands a mysticism.
Yes, that was a little quote from Louis de Broglie, who received the Nobel Prize for a paper he wrote on the theory that describes the wave nature of matter.
The wave-particle duality.
Yes.
Which is one of the great puzzles of physics.
Yes. The complementarity, the dual aspect, that means that quantum things don't have a concrete reality until they're observed.
You've taken this notion of Hylozoism, starting with physics, but you've looked at it in a broader sense.
It opens up the sorts of questions that become valid scientific questions. When you do a science, you want to start with a well-posed scientific question, and so what informs you as to deciding what could be a well-posed scientific question is your worldview, which, if you have a materialist worldview, you would say that certain types of questions are not well-posed. But if you have a Hylozoic or panpsychist worldview, you expand the types of questions that could be considered well-posed scientific questions.
For example?
Like telepathy. Can telepathy exist? Most of the parapsychological questions would be in this category.
Well, and you raise a wonderful example of some Nobel laureate in physics, Anderson, I think was his name, at Princeton, who basically published a critique of Dean Robert John, the dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton, who was engaged in parapsychological experiments. And this fellow Anderson said, that's unscientific. It's simply out of the question to even explore the idea that telepathy might be possible.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was saying. That so if you start with a particular worldview, like a materialist worldview, then then you would say that questions like Robert John was investigating. Can the mind either affect or predict the outcome at some level of a random experiment?
Quantum random generators.
Yeah. He found very nice results, but at a very, very small level. But at least anything that's not zero in this field is a very important result. If you start out with the materialist mindset, you just say, well, no, that can't be a valid question.
Well, I have to say this. in response, because I've done a number of interviews with my friend Edwin May, physicist who received several $1 million in government funding during the days when the government was financing remote viewing research to do parapsychology experiments, and he considers himself a physicalist or a materialist. And he believes, well, yeah, we really can't explain it today based on material science, but maybe in the future we can. All we need to do is explain how information can travel from the future to the present, how some kind of signal can go from a distant object into the human brain, and what sort of organ exists in the human brain to receive it. Of course, we have no idea about any of those, but, there's this notion of promissory materialism that sooner or later we'll figure it out.
Sure. And who knows, like you said, he did get some nice funding, and it could be a semantic technique. You want to you say what the funders want to hear.
Yeah.
But
not just the funders, but his scientific colleagues. He could walk into, Princeton University or the Pentagon or some other high-level establishment where money is being doled out and speak their language, and they wouldn't consider him some sort of California woo-woo person.
Yeah, and that's why it is valuable in this field to be able to describe the connection to quantum physics in a very careful way that doesn't frighten off the real quantum physicists if you say something that's just not right.
Yeah.
And that's right.
Yeah, your background is astrophysics.
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't quantum physics. It was planetary astrophysics. But yes. And for example, Robert John, I think the research that you were talking about, I think he was funded by the Department of Defense to do that research.
I think for the most part it came from a private foundation.
Was it private? Okay.
Yeah.
I heard that he got some defense
it might
funding.
It might be the case, but I think his initial funding came, as I recall, from the Fetzer Foundation, from John Fetzer, the owner of the Detroit Lions, who has done some wonderful work with his foundation, and from McDonnell of McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation. But we're talking about wealthy industrialists who took the money out of their own pockets.
Okay. And McDonnell Douglas Aircraft. Maybe that's what I was thinking of, because the Air Force would be interested in that in that research, because even if there's a very small effect of the mind with electronic instruments, nowadays aircraft
absolutely
is very important.
Yeah.
And so anyhow, there's people. In Department of Defense, they did fund some remote viewing research, like you mentioned.
To the tune of about $20 million over 20 years.
And I think that those types of organizations fund this type of research because they're not ideological. They want to know about what works.
They're very practical.
Yes.
And they're looking for results. And they saw enough results to keep that program funded for 20 years.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
But you, as a hylozoist, are taking a step beyond what might be considered practical in terms of negotiating the politics of getting funding.
Well, perhaps, but I think nowadays there's enough. There's a growing realization that there's a sort of a quiet revolution going on in the fundamental philosophy of science.
Yes.
And so I don't think this type of research has to remain outsider research.
Well, it's true. Just a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Philip Goff, a professor of philosophy in England, who is a panpsychist and argues strongly for the panpsychist position. And he told me when he started out as a graduate student, people told him, well, you can't graduate. You won't get your doctoral degree for advocating panpsychism. It's unacceptable. And now now he says it's still a minority position, but it's considered respectable.
Yeah, I think it is. And like in the Tucson Science of Consciousness conferences, they've been going on for like 24 years now, yes. And you've been involved with since the beginning.
I have.
I've been to some of them. I think like in that group, Panpsychism is now respectable. And even in some camps, it's kind of considered the most feasible approach going forward.
Yeah.
Because if you're not a panpsychist, but you do want to bring consciousness into your model theory of reality, you introduce a new problem. You're an emergentist, so consciousness operating in the world has to emerge at some point after the Big Bang or some point of complexity of biological systems. And so that introduces a new, very difficult problem that you have to answer. If you're a panpsychist or hylozoist, in which lifelike aspect or mindlike aspect is connected with all aspects of reality, you don't introduce this new problem of emergentism.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there a distinction between panpsychism and hylozoism, or are they just two different words for the same thing?
I think a technical philosopher would map out distinctions, but I think they're fine distinctions. Mm-hmm. I think maybe hylozoism could be a form of panpsychism, where panpsychism is a very general term, that some kind of lifelike or mindlike aspect is involved with all aspects of matter. And hylozoism might be specifically focused on the lifelike aspects. Mm-hmm. But I pretty much think of them as similar. Yeah. Same.
Because when it comes to distinguishing consciousness from life, well, many people think that there are lower forms of life, like bacteria, that aren't at all conscious.
Yes. Like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people used to say animals aren't conscious.
Right.
And now we know, now you can measure that, at least some kinds of higher animals have self-awareness. They can recognize themselves in a mirror. And throughout the decades, Western scientific mindset has been pushing down the level at which we acknowledge that consciousness exists. And I think the panpsychism or hylozoism is really just just taking that to the logical extent.
Mm-hmm. I know, for example, when I interviewed Philip Goff, he raised a very important point, I thought. He pointed to the research of an Australian biologist named Monica Gagliano, who's shown that in plants, I think in her case it was the pea plant, she was able to demonstrate Pavlovian conditioning, which means that the plant itself exhibited a mind-like property of forming an association.
Yes, and I've heard about recent research in potato plants along those lines and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So there's I don't know if I'd call it consciousness. It might be unconscious, but it's mental in the sense of an association being formed.
Yeah, some kind of mind-like aspect, some kind of psyche-like aspect, or some kind of life-like aspect.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see if we can distinguish then between hylozoism or panpsychism and metaphysical idealism. I've done many interviews with Bernardo Kastrup, who is a very strong advocate for idealism, a monistic point of view. Not just that there are mind-like aspects, but that mind is everything.
Yes. So you can be all sorts of panpsychists. Mm-hmm. You could be a dualist panpsychist, in which you believe in matter and mind, or matter and consciousness, as fundamental aspects of reality, and they interact. And but as long as the consciousness aspect interacts in some way with all of the matter aspect, then that's panpsychist approach. Mm-hmm. Or you could be an idealist panpsychist, in which you believe that the mind-like aspect or the consciousness-like aspect of reality is the fundamental aspect, and the material aspect, physical aspect, is derived out of that somehow. Mm-hmm. That's idealism. And so that's also a type of panpsychism, but it's a different kind of panpsychism. Yeah. You can also be a materialist panpsychist. Maybe that's kind of what Ed May was talking about, in which you believe only in material aspect of reality, but you somehow collapse. I don't subscribe to this, but you somehow collapse consciousness to material aspect, and all matter has it as well. And so that's also panpsychist, but it's not a very...
Yeah, now, my sense is that the best potential strategy for materialists who want to do that is to look at higher dimensions of space, that that consciousness may operate in some other space than the three-dimensional or four-dimensional space-time matrix that we're familiar with.
If you take the approach that the association of material physical reality with consciousness-like or lifelike aspect of reality goes through the quantum aspect, which sort of is the consensus now that if there is this connection, that's where it could happen. Mm-hmm. That introduces new problems because we know that the quantum systems, they behave in ways that can't be explained, that are locally causal and logical. And that was Einstein's complaint with quantum mechanics. So if you can't rationally explain even a simple quantum experiment like the double slit experiment in a way that is locally causal and rational, then you have to go to new ways to explain even the fundamental little physics experiment.
Yeah. Now, one term that I hear all the time, and it's used by many of my friends, although I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it, is the idea of non-locality.
Sure. Non-locality, we know, operates in basic little physics quantum systems.
Mm-hmm. It's the idea, I guess, of what's called quantum entanglement.
Yes, entanglement is how non-locality comes into the play of particle physics, mm-hmm. And we more and more, as time goes on, we're finding more and more macroscopic systems, larger scale systems that are shown to be connected in some way to quantum operations, like through biology and birds, magnetic navigation, and chlorophyll, photosynthesis molecules are shown to be connected to quantum entanglement. So that's a possibility where non-locality may also be involved in large things functioning.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of quantum entanglement suggests to me that time and space, as we think of them through our sensory mechanisms, might be something of an illusion, because it's possible that molecules or particles at the other end of the universe can be entangled with particles in my body.
Yeah. In order to solve even a simple quantum system mathematically even, you have to integrate over the entire universe formally. Mm-hmm. You do all sorts of approximations in practice to get a result. But yes, that's the way the theory works.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we're going to do another interview on your work regarding the African Genesis and the megalithic astrophysical map of the universe that you didn't discover, but you explored and into some very sophisticated mathematical measurements of. But I want to jump ahead just to point out that one of the conclusions that you drew is that it seems as if ancient people in Africa, prehistoric people, long before Egyptian civilization reached its height, had apparently a deep astronomical knowledge of things that today we know about because of advanced instrumentation. And doesn't that suggest the idea of some sort of a quantum interconnectedness or entanglement with these ancient, probably pre-literate people and the universe itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that work, I started out with a study of ancient megalithic large stone monuments and found suggestions of this kind of knowledge. So then if you accept that, okay, maybe they did have this kind of knowledge, or hypothesize maybe they had that kind of knowledge. How did they have this knowledge, advanced knowledge of the universe? There's really three possible ways. Some group gave them the knowledge, or
aliens who came in UFOs,
or that's one, or two. Maybe it was knowledge passed down from a much more ancient human civilization, or through some sort of non-physical or intuitive way of knowing about the universe. So there's really three distinct, different ways.
And I suppose there are scholars, many of them on the fringes of culture, but who have tried to make the case for all three of those possibilities.
Yes.
Ancient aliens, a breakaway civilization, maybe intelligent dinosaurs 65 million years ago traveled to outer space. Or this idea, the third possibility, strikes me as consistent with your notion of Hylozoism. If the whole universe is alive and interconnected, that would be a great way to understand parapsychological phenomenon and some of these things that we see where ancient people are able to exhibit extraordinary knowledge.
Yeah. That actually may be the most interesting one of the three possibilities. And we know there are people who have been studied, like the Kogi people in Central America, who've maintained their ancient practices of developing awareness in the inner aspect of reality through very long-term meditation in dark caves as children. The Kogi priests are brought up that way. And maybe through that kind of practice, it's possible to develop advanced knowledge of the universe through non-conventional, non-physical methods.
I mean, the very notion of Hylozoism would suggest that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, although you were probably the person, to my knowledge, most associated with that term in the current era, it's an ancient term.
Yeah, it's an ancient term. I didn't really do a whole analysis of should I use Hylozoism versus Panpsychism. I just hit on the term and saw how I could make it with those three words, hylostochastism, hylostatism, a kind of a triptych. And that's why I used it. There's a little section in the Yale University Library on Hylozoism. So they have my book in there. And when we went to a conference that was co-hosted in the area last June, a couple of students and I took a trip to the Yale Library and found my book up in the stacks. They have a section on Hylozoism, and it's a technical philosophical term that's been used for a long time.
Goes at least back to the ancient Greeks, if not further. So it's a world view that I would think if it would suggest, yes, let's go in a cave and meditate, or let's practice clairvoyance or remote viewing, because we're part of a larger living organism, and we have an immediate connection with aspects of the cosmos that are much bigger than we are.
Yeah, if you have a panpsychist view or hylozoic view, in that lifelike aspect or mind-like aspect is connected with all aspects of reality, all beings, then you're naturally going to think about, okay, how is my life, my consciousness connected with all the other beings? Is there some supermind connection that we can connect with?
Well, and may I ask you, how has this view affected you personally?
I think it's allowed a foundation, a confidence in pursuing the sort of research that we do at CIHS and the sort of studies and teachings when you kind of realize or appreciate this view of reality, you can operate in these realms more comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Now, because I gather from our previous discussions, in your case, you always had an interest in these things before you got trained as an astrophysicist.
That's true. That's actually this interest, integrative interest, I had before I went into physics in the first place. And actually, it's why I decided to study physics in school.
Mm-hmm.
So as a young person, I had intuitive or connective experiences, or in parapsychology, I call it psychic experiences, and I knew that the consensus reality didn't validate that those experiences were real, but they were personal experiences of a young person. So I wanted to, and I could see that the response was that, well, that's not a scientific experience. As physics says, you can't have those kind of experiences. They can't be real. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, okay, I'm going to go, and when I'm in school, I'm going to study physics and find out if that's true. Mm-hmm. And you go all the way through, and you study physics, and you study modern physics and quantum physics, and you find out it's not necessarily true. Mm-hmm. that in conventional physics, in classical physics, it is true that the universe is deterministic, and there's no place for consciousness acting in the world. But in quantum physics, it reopens the possibility that consciousness could be a fundamental aspect of reality.
And I suppose it's fair to say that this early interest in something larger than a materialistic universe, I would call it maybe an instinct for hylozoism that you experienced as a child, is what motivated you to give up a very successful career in planetary science, working with NASA on the Voyager 2 project, and to become eventually the president of a tiny college in the San Diego area.
Yes, yeah. So that it was really an opportunity to reconnect with my early integrative interest mm-hmm. in that way. Mm-hmm. And certainly it's not abandoning the scientific interest, because it's really combining it with the early integrative interest. And that's right. I was working on the draft of the book that became The Mechanism Demands of Mysticism at the time that I read an interview with Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama, founder of CIHS, and what he said in his interview was his approach to integrating the science and spirit was very much along the lines of the approach I was taking in integrating in my book draft. Mm-hmm. So that's why I contacted him and got connected with him.
That's how the connection was made. And I'll just mention right now, we did a previous interview about Dr. Motoyama, which I can link to in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for people who haven't already watched that. It's a very interesting study. Motoyama was an inspiration to me as well.
Yes.
Well, Thomas Brophy, once again, a fascinating discussion. I'm delighted that you're here in Albuquerque. I know we have 2 more interviews planned, so I encourage our viewers to check our program listings for further interviews.
I'm looking forward to them.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP. Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of issue 6 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine.